آینده ایران در دستان شماست. مردمی.
Madam President, Iran claims to be an Islamic republic. But as this resolution makes clear, it is also one of the world's most repressive regimes. I therefore have a question to the mullahs in Tehran. If you represent a God that is good, powerful, and merciful, then why do you need to repress, torture, and murder your people so much? No, your regime is a blasphemy and an abomination to every decent Muslim, every person of faith, and every person of conscience. You have brought your country to such desperate straits that you are now signing agreements with China to give away your energy sector and to give away your critical infrastructure. They will not complain about your human rights abuses, but I'm not sure Allah will be pleased that you are becoming vassals to a godless communist regime. However, if you want better relations and the easing of sanctions with us, stop this repression now. This is inhuman what you're doing to your own people. And one last thing. I have a request to the diplomats from our nation states and from our European External Action Service. Next time you meet with Mr. Zarif, who is a smiling Ribbentrop, just remember what kind of nasty regime he represents. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Iman Porutan. I'm the chairman of the Board of Trustees and executive director of the New Iran. And on behalf of all members and supporters of the New Iran and the opposition group, I welcome you today to today's webinar of one of the webinar series that the New Iran holds a few times a year. Before I introduce our distinguished guest today, a couple housekeeping notes. As it was announced earlier, we do have attendees that are attending this webinar from inside Iran. That is why we're keeping this format as a webinar format, which means as you're watching this program, you cannot see other attendees for security reasons. Your microphone and your chat features have been disabled. However, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should all be seeing a Q&A button. During the speech, if you wish, you can post your questions, and time permitting, after Mr. Sikorski's speech, he has been kind enough to allow for a few minutes of Q&A that we will try to answer your question. Also, if you're from inside Iran and you do not wish for your name to be shown when you post your question, there is an anonymous checkbox. You can select that and your name will not be shown to others and it will only be shown as anonymous. Our guest today, the Honorable Radoslaw Sikorski, is a member of the European Parliament for Poland, sitting on committees for foreign affairs, the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and the Security and Defense Subcommittee. He is the chairman of the Delegation for Relations with the United States. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard and a distinguished statesman at CSIS in Washington, D.C. He was Poland's Minister of Defense from 2005 to 2007, Foreign Minister from 2007 to 2014, and Speaker of the Parliament from 2014 to 2015. He served as a war reporter in Afghanistan and Angola. From 2001 to 2005, he was a resident scholar at AEI and director of its New Atlantic Initiative. Together with Carl Bildt, he launched EU's Eastern Partnership. He proposed and helped to set up the European Endowment for Democracy. In 2014, he led the EU mission to Kiev, which stopped the bloodshed on the Maidan. Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the 100 global policy intellectuals, quote unquote, for speaking the truth even when it's not diplomatic. He is the author of several books, most recently Polska Może Być Lepska. I hope I didn't kill this word. Mr. Sikorski graduated from Oxford University with a BA in politics, philosophy, and economics. He's married to the writer Anne Applebaum. And on a personal note, it was my honor to meet in person Mr. Sikorsky a few years back at the annual United Against Nuclear Iran. In that conference, there were probably about a couple dozen speakers and panelists. The only person in that conference that, in addition to policy discussions about JPOA and other related matters, spoke about the people of Iran, the fact that the people of Iran are dissatisfied with this regime, was Mr. Sikorsky. Since then, I've had the honor to meet with him and our team in Belgium and also online. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce Mr. Sikorsky now. Mr. Sikorsky, if you wish, please, if you can, please, if you turn on your, there we go, video and also your microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sikorsky, I will mute myself and turn off my video so all the focus will be on Sikorsky. Welcome, and go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction. And I'm particularly pleased that you noticed that I look at Iran not as a part of the geopolitical puzzle, but you know, in Poland we particularly cherish the word solidarity, and it's solidarity with people who live under a regime that they didn't have a chance to democratically vote for, that we feel solidarity with. Europe, Poland, and Iran go back a long way. If you read the history of the Roman Empire, the first triumvirate was dissolved when Crassus was defeated at the gates of Persia. Sometimes you defeated Rome, sometimes Rome got the better of you. Poland has had diplomatic relations with Iran since the 15th century. So Iran is an ancient people, a fixture, and irrespective of what kind of government it has, I believe it should be taken into account as a serious factor, and not just in the Middle East. You represent an ancient civilization with continuity, with a cultural heritage, with civilizational features and the DNA that we are somewhat familiar with, and that I feel requires respect and understanding. The European Union, of course, is a new kind of actor in international affairs. Under the Lisbon Treaty, we have pledged ourselves to conduct foreign policy in common, But on Iran, it's also some of the member states, and you know which ones, that participate in the JCPOA. So I think you need to take account of this dual nature. We are both nation states, which some of which still conduct foreign policy, including with Iran, and we also have delegated some of our powers to Brussels, to our joint Foreign Affairs Council, and to our High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. And it is the first High Representative, Lady Ashton, who made the decisive moves, who conducted the crucial conversations with the Iranian regimes that prepared what eventually became JCPOA. And JCPOA and solidarity with the Iranian people are two sides of the coin, I think, because to get a deal on peaceful uses of nuclear energy and on Iran denying to itself a nuclear weapon, of course we need to deal with whoever is in charge in Tehran. On the other hand, I think you've found that the European Union is one of the most consistent and vocal critics of the human rights abuses of the same regime. Which, of course, is a dilemma, because on the one hand, we want to have a deal which ensures that the Middle East does not see any further proliferation. And on the other hand, this is not a regime that we feel is optimal as being in charge of such a large and important country. This is a regime that, as I said in the speech, and I'm very flattered that you showed it again, that represses, tortures, and murders its own people, and not only its own people. The Islamic Republic, as I don't have to tell you, has been an exporter of terrorism, both retail and wholesale, since the beginning. Argentina, Lebanon, Iraq, Germany, London, who still remembers some of these outrageous acts? So the menu of problems that we have with the clerical regime with Iran is very long. It's not just the human rights abuses, it's not just the terrorism, it's not just the nuclear program, it's also the missile program, for example. In Poland, I actually personally signed the agreement with the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, to build a facility for the United States, a base for a component of the US missile defense system, a so-called Aegis on shore battery with anti-missiles at a place in northern Poland on the coast, specifically chosen because of the Earth's curvature, optimal for intercepting missiles launched from Iran and traveling towards the United States. So you see, even on issues like that, Europe, Poland, and Iran, unfortunately, affect one another. Europe has issued a joint declaration with the Islamic Republic in 2016 under the second High Representative for Foreign Policy, Federica Mogherini. And we still feel bound by that declaration. We have stuck by the JCPOA agreement, even though and when the United States left it. And as you know, there are now intensive negotiations in the triangle, that is composed of both the EU and the member states and Iran and the United States to try to restart the deal. And I appeal to you not to hold this against us, because yes, it is true that Iran wouldn't, I believe, be a threat to Europe under a freely chosen government. But the reality is that we have to deal with governments around the world as they are. And there are many non-democratic governments around the world that we deal with. North Korea, Saudi Arabia is actually an American ally, hardly a democracy. People's Republic of China, an aspiring superpower, and so on. Because in the system of nation states, Iran is sovereign, and irrespective of what kind of government it has, at the moment, it represents that territory and that structure of power, and that means we need to deal with it. Which, of course, affects the other leg of the relationship, our criticism of how Iran treats its own people. And here I want to be honest with you and not to give you false hopes. There is not that much that the EU or the West in general can do for you. We were upset by this just as much as you are now when my country, Poland, was under communist dictatorship. Communism, fascism, and theocracy were the three utopias of the 20th century. Soviet communism has collapsed. Chinese communism has transmogrified into something else. And fascism we defeated in war. So Iranian theocracy is the last standing 20th century utopia. And we felt lonely too at that time. We received sympathy, we received diplomatic protests, we received some assistance through broadcasts into the communist sphere. When people emigrated, they lived in freedom or received assistance. We had governments in exile. We had to print some books in Polish to be smuggled back into Poland. We went through decades of liberalization and tougher repression. And the West did not liberate us because it couldn't, because the price of that would have been a world war, and nobody wanted that. So we had to wait until the communist ideology became hollow, and even top communists stopped believing in it. In this sense, of course, your regime is a harder nut to crack because its ideology is tied to one of the world's great religion. Communism was ultimately verified by its failure because communists promised economic success and delivered economic disaster. Your regime doesn't promise economic success. It promises rewards in the afterlife. And of course, it is mixed with standing up to the United States, to Israel, and therefore nationalism, and therefore probably commands some support, not as much as it claims, but regimes that successfully portray the outside world as the enemy, think Cuba, think North Korea, usually do retain some support, at least within the ruling bureaucracy, which matters, which means that they are less susceptible to this kind of internal collapse that communism suffered. So the European Union will issue letters, will impose sanctions, will, if need be, isolate particular individuals that are guilty of human rights abuses or corruption on a grand scale. But the European Union will not liberate you for you. We do not have, despite what the regime says, we do not have a policy of regime change. We don't have it because we are not capable of carrying it out. And also because of the doctrine of sovereignty of states actually doesn't allow us to have such a policy. Of course, Iran is under two types of sanctions. Bureaucratically speaking more, but what I mean is under economic sanctions and under personal sanctions. Economic sanctions, as you know, go back a long way. We now have passed in the European Union a so-called Magnitsky Act, named after a lawyer who was judicially murdered in Russia. And these sanctions allow us to put restrictions not on countries, but on individuals among foreign governments, including top people that are actually guilty of abuses, which I think is the right way to do it. Because why should whole countries suffer for what their leaders, very often undemocratic leaders, do in their name? As you know, even our toughest sanctions allow for some trade to continue. For example, foodstuffs and medicines are exempt. But as you also know, even in this area, the trade has sunk to very low levels because of American national sanctions on payments in dollars. Poland was never able to deliver even pharmaceutical products or food to Iran because there was no payment system, and the European Union's attempt to create an autonomous payment system that would be safe from American sanctions has also in practice failed. So Iran is isolated and your people are suffering, in addition to the oppression, failing and falling living standards. And the clerical regime has now chosen China as a strategic partner, both politically and economically. I don't personally yet know the details of this agreement, but as I mentioned in my speech, and more news is emerging recently, I suspect that China will do it the way she does it with other countries. Sri Lanka is an example, but there are others. Namely, that you extend favorable loans to countries on the security of either the critical infrastructure, such as ports or railways, or on the security of future deliveries of critical raw materials. And it has already so happened that countries were unable to service their loans, and then the assets are forfeit. And I don't think this is a good place to be in for a proud and a sovereign country such as Iran. And this was the irony that I tried to point to in my speech, namely that a regime that claims to be Islamic, for the sake of its continued confrontation with Israel and the West, particularly the United States, is actually becoming subjugated to a communist dictatorship such as China. China is a very important country, and I think we are owed respect, and we owe a respect to it. But its ideology is Marxism-Leninism, and I'm not sure if Ayatollah Khomeini were still alive today, he would approve that Iran should become a local partner, vassal to a communist dictatorship. As far as I remember, the Communist Party of Iran was viciously persecuted by the clerical regime after the revolution. So there is the contradiction. The regime seems desperate and therefore willing even to sacrifice national sovereignty and independence and critical assets to a foreign power. Let me finish by just saying that I believe this regime is not forever. Regimes generally seem most stable just before their collapse. In the 1980s, in the Soviet Union and in the external empire in Central Europe, we all assumed that communism was forever. We resisted it, but we did it out of our own sense of self-dignity, that no sane or ethical person could subscribe to this stupid ideology. But we felt that this was a lost cause, that we were just protesting to keep our dignity rather than with any hope of success. And yet, between 1989 and 91, first in Central Europe and then in the Soviet Union itself, the whole thing crashed to earth in a matter of months and with actually very little bloodshed. I don't know the dynamics of the Iranian regime, but I hope that either through reform, which would be the preferable way, or through some kind of political earthquake, that Iran will get a political system that is more attuned with modernity, that allows for better circulation of elites, that allows for better relations with the rest of the world, that appoints the best people in your country to run key institutions, that allows for more economic opportunity, that allows all those Iranian people who had to leave the country for all these decades to come back and rebuild it. So without making any false promises, I just want to tell you that Europe will want to be helpful if Iran comes back into the fold of a law-abiding country that respects both international rules and rule of law and human rights internally. There's very little we can do to affect that outcome, but if it happens, we will do everything to encourage it, to sustain it, and to give you a chance to rebuild your country. And just so briefly after your new year, I just hope that let me repeat my greetings to you that the next new year we'll be able to have this conference in person in a more liberal, more democratic Tehran. Good luck.
Mr. Sikorski, thank you so much for your honest speech, even though that may not be something that most Iranians wanted to hear. Thank you for being frank. We have received quite a few questions ahead of time, and right now there's some questions. I know you have allocated another 27 minutes minimum to answer these questions. I'll try to go through them as quickly as possible, and thank you so much for responding to those. We have a anonymous question right now. Actually, let me ask you this other one first. Given the International Atomic Energy Agency, the fact that it has repeatedly stated its inability to truly assess the IRI's underground activities, why does EU insist on reviving JPOA, knowing that there's really hasn't been a way to truly monitor what nuclear activities Islamic Republic does?
Well, the person asking the question obviously have a different source of information from what I have. For what we were briefed was that while the JCPOA was in place, Iran was in compliance, that Iran had diluted its stock of enriched uranium, and that the International Energy Agency was certifying Iran to be in compliance. I have no privileged information to deny that, and therefore I need to trust the institution that others trust.
Thank you. I know that there had been reports that even from IAEA that they were not given permission to go some of the places they were supposed to be able to go. But thank you for that response. Let me get to this anonymous question. And by the way, those people who are at the overflow room inside YouTube, we have monitors watching those. If you have questions in Farsi and English, our team will be monitor. Send it to me, and I'll try to ask those also as I have time. This person is asking, Mr. Sikorsky, with regards to what you stated, that EU cannot do much for the people in Iran in this turmoil situation, would you please elaborate why EU and many European politicians cannot enforce simple, practical steps, such as banning the entrance of known regimes figures with long-known history of manslaughter and assassinations, freezing the financial resources of these known regime figures, continuing to bring up human rights concerns, assisting the international activities to bring the regime to international court, assisting the people of Iran by providing the means of access to uncensored internet, banning the establishment of regime and related media and lobbyists in the EU?
Well, I mentioned in my presentation that we have, but literally just recently, just a few months ago, given ourselves an instrument called the Magnitsky Act that will allow us to sanction individuals. We have already used it towards Belarus, where we've sanctioned people responsible for the repression there, including the president, Mr. Lukashenko. We are using it, we have used it already on Russian officials responsible for trying to poison Mr. Navalny. And yes, I believe that we should use it towards such officials everywhere in the world, including in Iran, where such abuses take place. Absolutely, we should do that.
Thank you. 42 years ago, Khomeini came to Iran with a bag full of beautiful words that people wanted to hear, and deceived the Iranian nation with his hollow promises. Given that history, how much credence does the EU give to Khomeini's words currently today that he has outlawed and forbidden developing nuclear bombs? They call it haram in Islam. Do you believe, Khamenei, that it says they're not building or they will not build nuclear bombs?
I think it's established fact that Iran did have a nuclear weapons program, and therefore whoever conducted it, I didn't know about these words of Khomeini, was certainly in breach of the fatwa, if it was a fatwa.
Thank you. I have a couple hypothetical questions. If the Islamic Republic tests its first atomic bomb, how do you think the EU will react?
The EU has no means to, we are a confederation that is a single market and that conducts its trade policy in common. We don't have an army. We don't have an air force. We don't have a nuclear component. Some of our member states have these things, but not the EU. And EU is not on the front line of confronting a theocratic Iran, because theocratic Iran threatens others ahead of us. First of all, Israel. Secondly, the United States. But I can tell you what will happen. If the regime achieved the aim of building such a weapon and exploded even a trial device, it would be decapitated by the United States.
Thank you. Follow-up hypothetical, as you mentioned, Israel. What position, if any, do you think the EU will take in the event of an Israeli military attack on Iran or Iran nuclear facilities?
Well, the history between you and Israel is, of course, a long and complicated one. You are the two non-Arab countries in the Middle East, and you used to be quite close allies. Israel is a country built on tragedy. And we don't need to go into history, but you know what I mean. It pursues some controversial policies, but it certainly has the right to protect its existence. And if you are an Israeli, a nation that suffered the attempt at total annihilation within the lifetime of people who are still alive, and the leaders of a foreign country are saying publicly that they intend to do that again, to wipe you off the face of the earth, you believe that because it's been tried to them before. And therefore, you have public support and you have the drive to prevent it from happening again. I'm not sure Israel is capable of doing that on its own. From what I understand, attacking Iran would be a major operation. It wouldn't be like the single raid that took out the Iraqi nuclear facility back in the 1980s. What was it called? Osirak? And recently there was also a strike at a suspected Syrian facility. Because Iran has a functioning military, functioning air defenses, in order to perform such a raid, you would first have to destroy Iran's anti-aircraft defenses. That's not an easy task. That would be itself a campaign of some days. And of course, Israel doesn't control the airspace between itself and Iran. So I don't think it can be done the way it was done before, and I don't think Israel can do it without at least the green light from the United States, more likely actual help from the United States. And then the difference between Israel doing it and the US doing it becomes a matter of degree, a matter of proportions, actually. I think it's something that would be highly undesirable, because we also know that the regime has been preparing for that eventuality for decades. That the Iranian government has well laid down and logistically prepared plans to strike back at Israel, the United States, and the West in general in asymmetrical ways. Attack our shipping, attack our population centers, attack targets all around the world. So it would cause a global mayhem. And that's why talk, jaw is better than war, as the saying goes. Because I think everybody would lose by that scenario.
Thank you. Of course, I know that quite a few people would potentially look at another angle of that, that the same way that the world appeased Chamberlain in England a long time ago and then didn't really take the right action against Hitler, and then it happened. But thank you so much for that response.
Well,
go ahead.
Poland was the next in line after Czechoslovakia. And the same Prime Minister, Chamberlain, encouraged Poland to fight when he had no intention of coming to our assistance. But remember what the object of appeasement was, and that object was achieved. The object of appeasement was to gain time, because Britain was completely unprepared to face up to Nazi Germany. So by betraying Czechoslovakia and allowing Poland to fight on its own, Britain gained a year. And it was that year during which they built the Spitfires that eventually gave it victory in the Battle of Britain. So strategically speaking, it was cruel, but correct.
Thank you so much. I have a Farsi question that I would like to translate and ask you. You may have already answered part of that question. Dear Mr. Sikorsky, thank you so much for your presence today. I have a question that I hope you will respond frankly. A large number of Iranians think and believe that the Western countries actually prefer to have a weak government in Iran, such that those Western governments can actually satisfy their economic needs and their transactions with IRI. Do you believe that or not? And also, in addition just to supporting words, are there other things that you think the EU will do, has done, or in the process of doing? In the last part, you may have already answered.
Look, I love conspiracy theories as much as the next man, but it's simply not true. For us, Iran is a challenge in the sphere of terrorism, as I said before. And in terms of the economy, we have learned that we prosper when our neighbors and economic partners prosper too. You know, Iran has actually about the same GDP as Poland right now, even though you have twice as many people. If you were as rich as Poland or as rich as the European average, your GDP would be double or treble what it is today. Therefore, you would be buying double or treble of goods and services from us. We would all be much better off. And instead of spending money on missile defense and other useless pieces of kit, we would be investing in Iranian beachfront resorts, and our tourists would be visiting Isfahan, and you would have an influx of visitors, which you used to have. No, nobody benefits from Iranian self-containment, self-denial of development. This is just pure loss to humanity in the service of a utopia, in the service of political Islam, which I think is a retrograde idea. We all respect people of faith, but I don't think faith should order how complex societies are run today. And I know that Prophet Muhammad was a temporal ruler in the 7th century, but this was a simple tribal society. Today we have really complex societies interacting globally, and for that, 7th century rules are simply not good enough.
Thank you. I'll now combine two related questions. One of them says, the first one, given your role and experience in liberating Poland from communist regime, what would your advice be to the Iranian opposition, both outside and inside Iran, to accelerate regime change in Iran? Followed by, in your opinion, what is the most effective way that the Iranian diaspora and opposition groups can best garner support from the European Union? What is our greatest barrier, both politically and economically?
We've discussed this before, and I'm not sure to what extent our experience is applicable to your situation, because your regime, as I mentioned, is at least in theory, religiously inspired and more radical even than communism was. What helped in Poland starting in the 1970s was that regime officials started to have doubts about the ideology. And starting in the 1970s, they began sending their children for education no longer to Moscow, but to Harvard and Columbia. By the 1980s, it was clear that regime officials didn't believe in the ideology anymore. And the solidarity movement at that time started talking to the softer members of the regime. What happened in Poland was that the Jaruzelski, towards the end, communism in Poland took the form of a military dictatorship, in fact, with General Jaruzelski imposing martial law and then becoming party leader and running the country. And he tried one economic reform after another within the straitjacket of communist ideology, and it just wasn't working. And so eventually, when the country was a little bit like Iran, was economically on its knees, he started reaching out to the more moderate opposition to try to build bridges and to get the opposition to take on some responsibility for the tougher, more unpleasant reforms that it was seen were needed to fix the country. In Poland, it was complicated by the fact that there was, of course, an external control on the regime in the form of Soviet domination. But in the second part of the 80s, Gorbachev came to power and he allowed national communists to do their own experiments. You don't have that problem because your regime is your own. So I'm afraid you need to find channels of communications with some regime elements. because if the game is that reform, real political reform or loss of power means that those people have to lose their lives, then they'll fight to the bitter end. You need some kind of transition mechanism and some assurances that those who choose the path of reform will be appreciated for that. And of course, it's an ethically a very uncomfortable thing to do. You know, General Jaruzelski was responsible for killing demonstrators, for martial law, as I've mentioned. And yet, as part of the deal, he became president of a democratizing Poland by election by a semi-free parliament. And some people felt that that was a betrayal of the democratic revolution. But that way, we made the transition bloodlessly. And earlier, we were the first to go in 1989. We had a non-communist government under Jaruzelski presidency, even as the Berlin Wall was still standing. So that's an experience to study. Another experience to study, more ambiguous, is what's happening in Burma, where the generals, as you know, have made a deal. Now they seem to have reneged on the deal. And Aung San Suu Kyi was in this morally ambiguous position of having to justify very unpleasant policies for the sake of not returning to the previous status quo. These are very difficult choices, but they are preferable to a coup or an armed rebellion whose outcome is uncertain, and in which a regime that is ruthless and controls the sources of violence has a natural advantage.
Thank you for the detailed response, Mr. Sikorsky. I have a question here. The fact that Europe not having the policy of regime change in Iran is understandable. This is the question here. However, this question says, should an organization comes about that practically starts regime change operations from within with the support of outside, what kind of a support or policy or support and policy can they expect from the EU if should that happen by the Iranian people inside or outside?
Well, look at what we've done when other countries have carried out transitions to what we regard as a better state of affairs. Take Ukraine, which is, you know, a neighbor of the EU, but it wasn't always. So sanctions were immediately lifted. IMF money was immediately approved. And a huge program of economic and institutional support was launched. Ukraine now has per capita assistance from the EU of, I don't want to get this wrong, you can check this, but last time I looked, it was about €50 per person per year. So sort of pre-accession money, tens of billions of euros. Plus assistance in building better institutions. So, for example, we have signed a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine, which means that Ukraine is virtually economically integrated with the EU. So it's not just that Ukraine can export anything, it can export freely in most areas. It's almost part of the single market. With Ukraine, we even have a free an agreement on abolishing visas, which was difficult because it means a complete revamping of the interior ministry, It requires biometric passports, a database of passport issued, anti-corruption measures, control of borders, and help with modernizing border controls. And that's we now have agreements on hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being able to work in the European Union. Those are the kinds of things that should be on standby and should be activated the moment Iran shifts its policy towards convergence with the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. I know we have only 2 minutes left before our allocated time passes by. If you don't mind, I'll ask this potentially last question, unless you wish to answer a few more. I guess this question is, what made you support the Iranian people and specifically give that pointed speech at the EU Parliament, I think it was last November or December? And why do you think many other EU Parliament members have not reacted or do not react the way you have?
No, that's unfair towards my colleagues. There were many pro-Iran speeches, pro-Iranian people speeches in that session of Parliament. But look, you mentioned I was a war correspondent in Afghanistan in the 1980s. My longest trip and hardest, really quite dangerous, in 1987 was from Quetta in Pakistan to Herat, which is in Afghanistan, but was, of course, for many centuries, a city of Persian culture. It was the capital of the Timurid Empire and once contained some of the most beautiful Islamic buildings ever constructed. It's a fascinating place. Originally, actually, the seat of the Archbishopric of the Nestorian Christian Church. Then a Persian city, but somewhat, but of mixed Shia and Sunni denomination. And my mission to Herat was to find out and to document the fate of these monuments, because I felt that, and I spent several weeks in Herat, literally 100 yards from the tomb of Jami, the Persian poet. I saw the remains of the Mosala of Hussein Baikara. I traveled near Gazargah, with this beautiful mosque on the hills above Herat. So I went to Herat when the Soviets were defeated. My friend, the guerrilla leader, became the Amir, Ismail Khan, and he gave me a reception at the citadel of the Timurid rulers, originally set up by Alexander the Great. And I had an authors meeting to promote my book about this trip called Hak-e-Awliya, Dust of the Saints. And ever since visiting Herat, I, of course, wanted to visit Isfahan and Meshed to see similar buildings that were still standing. I haven't been to Meshed, but in 2014, I was able to visit Isfahan. I was on an official trip, but nevertheless, many Iranian people would approach me and say, look, nice to see you here, but we would like to see the tourists come back. We would like to return to normality, to return to a normal relationship with the world. And I think it took some courage for those people to tell me that while I was being a part of an official delegation. So, that confirmed my instinct that official Iran was not the only voice of the Iranian people, and that the Iranian people deserved better.
Mr. Sikorsky, thank you so much for your time today. I know that your time is very limited, and I know you were traveling, and we certainly appreciate and really thank you being at this point one of the very few voices of democracy and freedom, specifically supporting the people of Iran inside. As I showed you last time in our private meeting, and you also mentioned you have received, and we have received thousands and thousands of notes and thank you from inside Iran when they hear somebody with your stature speaking at an international forum like the European Union Parliament for and on behalf of the Iranian people. That's just immensely valuable for those people. We look forward to host you inside Iran in a free Iran, hopefully very soon. And as a last note to our participants and attendees, we're going to try our best to translate this in Farsi within a few days, this program, and widely promote it, distribute it, and we hope to be able to speak to Mr. Sikorsky in the near future again as international events with regards to Iran happens. If you have any last words, Mr. Sikorsky, floor is yours.
Well, just to tell you that if you do that, I have 1 million followers on Twitter. I'll make your cause and this program famous, at least in Poland.
That's fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it. We're going to get this video out. We're going to translate it in Farsi, and Mr. Sikorsky. And by the way, Mr. Sikorsky, it was very kind of you to actually retweet this program yourself. We very much appreciate it. I know the short video that we had prepared as of yesterday had over 5,000 views or 6,000 views just in Twitter. Thank you again so much, and stay safe.
Thank you, and good luck to free democratic Iran.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.